I was driving to the house that had once been the heart of our family. After my wife's death, it became my only refuge, a place where the walls still held her breath and the water by the dock still reflected her presence. But as I turned onto the familiar street, I realized that foreign footsteps had already erased my own. What I saw on the porch marked the end of the life I once knew, and the beginning of something my son could never have imagined. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Harold Whitman. I was 74 years old the autumn I drove back to the lake house. Retired now for nearly a decade, I had spent most of my life as a high school history teacher in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. After Marianne passed, the house in town lost its warmth. The curtains never moved. The chairs looked untouched. Even the wind felt quieter. So, that October, I decided to return to the only place that ever felt truly mine, and hers. Our house at Lake Meriwether. It was a 5-hour drive north through roads I could navigate, blindfolded. My truck, a '92 Ford with worn leather seats, groaned in the cold morning. I had packed only what I needed: a thermos of black coffee, a worn fleece jacket, a flashlight, a book of crossword puzzles I never seemed to finish, and the brass key that still had the old tag with Marianne's handwriting. Lake. I didn't bring much else. The rest, I told myself, was already waiting there. The trip took longer than usual. The trees had begun to turn, maple and ash igniting in red and gold, each mile burning deeper into my memory. Road signs blurred past: Ashland, Cornucopia, Red Cliff. Each town held a ghost of a time we'd stopped together. I drove in silence. No radio. Just the occasional hum of tires over frost-cracked pavement and the distant call of geese tracing invisible lines overhead. I felt the years in my spine, in my hands, but I kept driving. Marianne used to hum when we reached the final curve before the lake. She'd always point out the birch tree, leaning like a dancer in the wind, just before the gravel began. That tree was still there, bent a little lower now. As I turned off the main road and heard the first crunch of gravel under my tires, something inside me shifted. Not joy, not sadness either. Just a quiet acknowledgement that I was arriving somewhere that remembered me, even if no one else did. The lake came into view slowly, the water silver and still. The fog hovered over its surface like breath held too long. My house sat low on the hill, crouched in the trees like an old dog waiting for its master. The roof needed work. The chimney was chipped, but it stood. It stood exactly where we left it. I parked at the edge of the driveway, where the cedar posts still marked the entrance. Moss had grown up their sides, soft and wet. The sign that used to read Whitman Family Retreat had long since faded, but I could still make out the carved initials if I looked closely. I didn't go inside right away. I sat in the truck, engine off, watching the wind move through the pine needles. I listened. Birds were distant. The water lapped gently. Somewhere a woodpecker worked rhythmically. Everything else was still. Eventually I stepped out and felt the cold rise through the soles of my shoes. The cabin smelled like old cedar, damp earth, and something else. The faint trace of burnt wood from a fireplace that hadn't been used in years. I walked slowly up the stone path we laid ourselves in 1974. Each stone had a crack, I remembered, a history of our hands setting them one by one. I used to curse those stones. Now I treasured each uneven step. The key turned harder than I expected. The door resisted, swollen from moisture and neglect. When it finally opened, the inside greeted me not with warmth, but with memory. The living room still held the plaid couch we argued about at the furniture store. The bookshelf leaned slightly. Her scarf, the blue wool one, hung on the hook where she left it that last spring. I didn't touch it. I moved through the rooms like a stranger moving through a dream. Dust lay gently on surfaces, but nothing felt abandoned. It felt paused. The kitchen held 2 mugs still in the drying rack. Her teapot sat on the stove, copper tarnished but upright. The small window above the sink looked out at the lake, framed by branches that had grown wilder since I'd last been there. Outside, the water didn't seem to move, but I knew it did. I left my things by the door and made no sound as I sat in the armchair by the window. It creaked under my weight, acknowledging the years. I didn't light a fire. I didn't unpack. I just watched the lake, the reeds bending slightly, the sky softening into late afternoon. And in that long silence, I remembered who I used to be. Not the widower, not the quiet man in the corner of the retirement group, but the man who built this place with his hands, the man who loved a woman who once called this view heaven. I didn't cry, not that day. I simply sat and let the house settle around me. The air inside was cool, heavy with memory. I heard the click of the old clock in the hallway. The rhythm felt familiar, reassuring. This was my return, not to reclaim, not to change anything, but to remember. And maybe, slowly, to begin again. I arrived earlier than I had planned. The road was dry and the wind at my back, and for once the silence didn't weigh heavy on me. I had imagined pulling up to the lake house and finding it as I left it. Quiet, solemn, a little wounded, like me. I hadn't told anyone I was coming, hadn't called ahead, hadn't made it known. It didn't seem necessary. It was my place. That's what I believed. But as I turned onto the gravel path and came through the opening in the pines, I felt the first disturbance. Not in the earth or the sky, but in something smaller, some invisible thread pulling in my chest. The gravel had been shifted recently, new tire tracks, not mine. And there were footprints in the muddy edge of the drive, the kind made by shoes too clean, too soft to belong here. Then I saw them. They were on the porch, my porch, not as visitors, not as passers-by. They were arranged comfortably, spread out like a family gathered for a summer meal. My son Daniel sat in the chair I built from driftwood and varnish, the one Marianne used to sit in with her tea and a book of poems. He had his boots up on the railing, arms wide like a man in possession of something earned. Beside him was his wife, Allison, and flanking her were her parents, Michael and Janice. The 4 of them were mid-laughter, wine glasses in hand, plates on their laps, sunlight catching the edge of a silver cheese knife that had once belonged to Marianne's mother. They didn't see me at first. My truck made little noise as it rolled to a stop. I sat there behind the wheel for a few long seconds, watching through the windshield, the engine ticking as it cooled. No one looked over. They were too comfortable, too absorbed in their afternoon indulgence. I noticed the blanket tossed on the back of the chair next to Daniel. It was hers, Marianne's wool blanket, blue with small white stitches near the edges. I remembered buying it for her in Vermont during a winter trip. She used to wrap it around her knees in the evenings when the cold crept through the window panes. Now it hung there carelessly, like a rag. I stepped out of the truck slowly, not slamming the door. Still no one looked up. As I approached the steps, I took in every detail. The coasters we always used on the porch table were gone, rings of condensation now pooled under their glasses. A magazine lay sprawled open across the table, and one of my mother's ceramic bowls sat full of olives, pits resting on a napkin beside it. That bowl had been packed away in the cupboard above the sink, or so I thought. Someone had gone through the cabinets. A bottle of red wine leaned against a clay flower pot, half empty. I could see Allison's laughter from behind her glass, her head tilted back, her legs folded beneath her like she belonged. The ease of her posture sent a chill up my spine. They weren't visiting. They had moved in. Daniel finally noticed me. He turned his head slightly and froze, the glass halfway to his mouth. The air shifted then, thickened. His smile flickered and faded like a light bulb dimming under a bad wire. Allison looked over next, then her parents. One by one, their expressions changed. Not guilt, not even embarrassment, but something else. A kind of blank surprise, as if they hadn't considered the possibility that I might actually return, as if they'd rewritten the story and omitted me. No one moved to greet me. No one stood. Daniel opened his mouth but said nothing. I didn't speak either. I stood at the base of the steps, letting the silence widen. I took in the scene as one might observe strangers at a bus stop, detached, polite, but fundamentally elsewhere. The porch didn't feel like mine anymore. The walls remembered me, but the air didn't. I looked down and noticed a pair of slippers by the door. My slippers, worn and soft, the heel still bent from how I used to slide them on without using my hands. Someone had been wearing them. I could see the indentation from toes that weren't mine. I didn't climb the stairs. I didn't raise my voice. I simply stood there, breathing in the pine and wine, the foreign scent of lavender lotion and perfume that didn't belong to anyone I loved. It was a robbery without broken windows, a displacement without violence. They had invaded not through force, but through quiet entitlement. The door behind them was ajar. I could see into the hallway, my hallway, and noticed the picture frames had been moved. One of Marianne's paintings no longer hung near the entry. Instead, a metal-framed mirror caught my reflection, small and distant. The mirror was unfamiliar, sterile. I hadn't seen it before. I could feel the weight in my chest grow heavier, not from grief this time, but from something colder. Displacement, erasure, a creeping sense that I had been slowly unwritten, that my presence here was now the disturbance. They hadn't changed the locks. They hadn't needed to. Ownership wasn't taken with a deed or a key. It was taken in the rearrangement of chairs, the removal of coasters, the repurposing of blankets. It was in the way they laughed on my porch and looked through me when I returned. I turned around before anyone spoke, my boots pressed into the soft dirt where their footprints were. I didn't want to hear explanations, didn't need apologies or invitations. What I needed was space, mental, emotional, strategic. I had given too much, let too much slide. I walked back to the truck and opened the door. The sun had dropped lower. Shadows fell across the gravel, long and quiet. I sat behind the wheel and stared at the house. The paint still peeled in the same spot on the window frame. The wind moved through the trees like it always had, but everything else had shifted. Everything human, everything sacred. As I drove away, I didn't look in the rearview mirror, not because I didn't care what happened behind me, but because I already knew. They weren't guests. They weren't waiting for me. They had already replaced me. The lake house had become theirs in gesture, in rhythm, in silence. But the deed still said otherwise. I drove home slowly, the road unwinding beneath me like an old ribbon coming apart at the seams. I didn't rush. There was no one waiting for me. No meal to return to. No porch light left on out of habit. The world had gone quiet again, and I let it. Each passing tree, each blurred fence post, each forgotten mailbox seemed to nod as I passed, as if they too understood the weight of coming back to a place that no longer remembered you. The city unfolded in gray as I crossed into the outskirts of Duluth. The hum of traffic, the occasional siren in the distance, the stoplights blinking without urgency. Everything was familiar, yet remote. I turned onto my street where the trees were trimmed and the sidewalks uneven. The house sat there as I had left it, the lawn still yellowed from the summer heat, a few fallen leaves gathered by the porch steps like quiet messengers. I parked along the curb instead of pulling into the driveway. I didn't know why. Maybe I didn't want to see my own name etched on the mailbox. Maybe I wasn't ready to step back into a life that had started to feel like a waiting room. When I opened the door, The stale air hit me like a sigh, the kind that rises up from walls that haven't been spoken to, the kind that clings to furniture no longer in use. I stepped inside and let the silence close behind me. The thermostat still blinked its soft green light. The smell was the same: old coffee grounds, paper, dust. It was all exactly as I left it. And somehow that made it worse. I took off my coat and hung it on the hook that never held more than one. The narrow hallway stretched out ahead of me, a tunnel of memories dulled by repetition. The floor creaked under my weight. I didn't mind the sound. It reminded me that I was still there, that I still pressed into the earth, even if no one else noticed. I passed by the kitchen without stopping. I wasn't hungry. The sink was clean, the dish rack empty. One mug still sat on the counter, rim stained with old tea, the kind I used to make every evening before sitting by the window. I left it there. The living room had the same stillness, as if it were holding its breath. The armchair faced the television. The books on the shelf leaned against one another like tired men at a bus stop. I hadn't touched the curtains in weeks. Outside, the light faded into that gray-blue dusk particular to Minnesota, the kind that used to bring Marianne into the room just to say how lovely it was. I stood in the center of the room and looked around. Nothing was broken. Nothing was missing. And yet, the absence screamed, not in volume, but in shape. There were outlines where things used to be: her sewing basket beside the couch, the Afghan folded over the armrest, the faint indentation in the cushion where she used to sit cross-legged with a book in her lap. I walked down the hallway toward the bedroom, my feet slowing as I passed the linen closet. It still smelled like lavender and soap. I reached for the doorknob to the bedroom, but stopped. I didn't open it. Not yet. I wasn't ready to see the bed, to look at the nightstand with only one reading lamp, to feel the vacuum that had grown in the space where she used to breathe. Instead, I turned into the small study across the hall. My desk was cluttered, as always. Receipts, rubber bands, envelopes, stacks of things I meant to file, but never did. I sat down and picked up a pen. It was heavy in my hand, colder than I remembered. I opened a fresh page in my notebook and began to write. Not about feelings, not about memories, about facts. I wrote down the date. Then I listed every detail I remembered from the lake house: the wine glasses, the blanket, the magazine, the bowl, the footprints. I drew a rough layout of the porch and labeled who sat where. I noted the changes, the absence of coasters, the presence of slippers, the removed painting, the foreign mirror. I listed names: Daniel, Allison, Michael, Janice. I underlined each twice. I paused, staring at the names. Then I made a new heading: Timeline. I wrote today's date again and worked backwards. When had I last spoken to Daniel? When had he last asked about the lake house? When had Allison mentioned family gatherings and needing more space? I wrote down everything I could remember. Then I made another list: documents, the deed, the tax records, insurance, inheritance clauses, any papers that proved what the house was and to whom it belonged. I realized I hadn't looked at them in years, but I would now. The pen moved without pause. The silence of the house around me was no longer suffocating. It was surgical, focused. Every tick of the clock, every creak of the baseboard sharpened my mind. I stood up and went to the hall closet where I kept the lockbox. It was there, behind the stack of old board games and photo albums no one looked through anymore. I carried it to the desk and entered the combination. The latch clicked open, and the papers inside had the musty sweetness of things forgotten but preserved. There it was, the original deed with my name and Marianne's, the insurance policy, the letter from the tax office, all of it intact, untouched. My hands were steady as I spread them out on the desk. I took a breath and returned to my notebook. I created a plan, not for revenge, not for confrontation, but for reclamation. There would be no shouting, no accusations, just structure, law, precision. I would not beg to be included in a place that was already mine. I would not argue with those who smiled from my porch while erasing the woman who built it with me. The notebook filled page after page, lines written in block letters, arrows drawn, notes in the margins. I was building something, not just a defense, but a perimeter, something I hadn't done in years. By the time the room darkened completely, I hadn't turned on a single light. I didn't need to see the past. I knew it by heart. The future was what I was outlining now, word by word, line by line. I closed the notebook and placed it on the center of the desk. Then I stood and turned toward the hall again. I opened the bedroom door. The room was still, the air colder than the rest of the house. I stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed. The pillow beside me was undisturbed, untouched. It had held only dust for years, but now something stirred in me. Not grief, but clarity. The house may have been empty, but I no longer was. The next morning I woke early, not from rest, but from a kind of internal bell that rang once and left the silence changed. The window above my bed was rimmed with frost. The house was still dark. The city hadn't yet begun to breathe. I sat up slowly, knees stiff, the blanket clutched in my lap like a shield. The night had turned something over in me. I no longer felt stunned. I felt aligned. Every part of my mind was narrowing toward a single shape, and that shape was strategy. I moved through the house like I used to before school in my teaching days. Quiet, precise, methodical. I didn't touch the radio. I didn't brew coffee. I went straight to the kitchen table and cleared it. I laid down a yellow legal pad, a black ink pen, and a manila folder that held the deed to the lake house, the insurance papers, the tax statements, and a copy of Marianne's will. I sat in the chair by the window, the one with the cushion flattened by years of sitting, and began to write. I started with the word timeline, underlined twice. From the last conversation with Daniel to the moment I saw them on the porch, I traced every interaction backwards. I noted Allison's remark at Thanksgiving about finding space for all generations. I remembered the brief phone call in July where Daniel asked if I still visited the lake house often. Then, his hesitation when I said I hadn't been up in a while. I saw it now, how each breadcrumb had been carefully laid. I noted the dates. I made a chart. Then I drew a new heading, critical window. If they were settling in now, on a Thursday afternoon, that meant they were preparing for a longer stay, likely through the weekend, maybe even beyond. That gave me 3 full days before Monday. 3 days before Daniel could initiate a change of mailing address, contact local utilities, or request an informal declaration of usage. I didn't know if he had that intent, but I had to assume he did. Entitlement has a way of accelerating when unchallenged. I made 3 columns: legal, environmental, psychological. Under legal, I listed ownership documents, reviewed and verified, insurance policy, current and in my name, county tax statements, paid through December, legal counsel, to be consulted within 48 hours, emergency clause in will. To be reviewed under environmental, I wrote, security of premises, compromised, technological leverage, to be developed, accessibility, drive time, JACTRA 5.5 hours, external monitoring, required discretion, and under psychological, family history, relevant patterns of entitlement, emotional leverage, neutralized through silence, tactical language, avoid escalation. Objectives: preservation of legacy, prevention of erasure. Then I made a separate page titled Sequence of Action. I broke the next 72 hours into 6 segments. Each segment was aligned to one of the 3 categories. My first step was to secure the legal perimeter, No gaps, no delays. I remembered an old colleague of mine, Russell, who had transitioned into real estate law after retirement. I hadn't spoken to him in years, but I still had his card taped to the back of a filing cabinet drawer. I wrote his name down. Next, I thought about the town near the lake, Merrowfield. Small, tight-knit, but big enough to have a clerk's office, a hardware store, and 2 churches. I'd need to confirm if anyone in the township had been approached about changes to occupancy or land use. That would come later. Then I opened the folder and looked at the insurance policy. The clause for unauthorized occupants was vague, but potentially useful. I highlighted the section and made a note to discuss it with Russell. I read through every page again, slowly. I wasn't scanning. I was absorbing. I wanted every phrase, every sentence structure imprinted into me. If I were to defend what was mine, I would not be caught off guard. By late morning, the house had filled with soft light. Dust floated through the beams, coming in from the eastern window, illuminating the papers on the table like relics in a chapel. I paused and stared at the surface. This was my command center. The table where Marianne once rolled out dough for Sunday pies was now a war desk, and I felt no shame in it. I stood up and moved to the hallway closet, pulling down 2 boxes labeled Taxes 1980-2000 and Home Records. I sifted through them, page by page. Receipts for plumbing, for electrical work, for renovations to the lake house roof after the 1993 storm. I found a contractor's note signed by both me and Marianne, detailing the upgrades we made with our own hands. I smiled faintly. These weren't just documents. They were time-anchored truths. I selected the most important papers and placed them in a secondary folder labeled Foundation. The metaphor was not lost on me. In the afternoon, I created a checklist on the wall above the desk. Each task had a box next to it. I pinned up a calendar and circled the upcoming Monday in red. Then I wrote underneath it, in capital letters, Decision Point. I opened my desk drawer and took out a roll of painter's tape. I marked off the boundaries of the living room, taping off corners like evidence markers. This space, I decided, would remain dedicated to strategy until the situation resolved. It wasn't dramatics. It was logistics. The theater of war had always relied on maps and territory. I stepped back, looked at the wall, the table, the layers of thought forming a kind of protective shell around me. This wasn't about vengeance. This wasn't even about justice. It was about sovereignty, identity. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was trying to keep the shape of my life from being erased by people who saw my silence as surrender. I didn't know how this would end, but I knew it would begin with order, and time, and precision, and time I still had. It started in the basement. The old concrete stairs groaned under my weight as I carried down the boxes one by one. I hadn't been down there in years. The last time was to check for a leak that turned out to be nothing more than condensation from a burst of spring heat. Since then, I had avoided the place, partly because of the damp, partly because of what it represented: unfinished projects, forgotten hobbies, the kind of spaces where old tools rusted quietly and time collected in corners. But now, it would become something else. A workshop, a center of control, a quiet perimeter of resistance. I cleared the shelves along the back wall, paint cans from another decade, rusted nails in coffee tins, broken flashlights, unused batteries, and plastic sheeting that had long since yellowed. All of it came down. I set them aside with care, not to discard, but to repurpose. I swept the floor, scraped away old leaves that had blown in under the door, and washed the workbench clean with vinegar and a cloth. As I wiped away the dust, I saw the grain of the wood again, knots like eyes staring back at me. I took stock of what I had: tools, extension cords, screws, nails, old switchboards, flashlights, and a box labeled Spare Electronics that Daniel had once left in my garage years ago. I remembered how he used to tinker with wires as a boy, building radios and setting off the smoke alarm more than once with his homemade circuit boards. Irony, I thought, was a quiet thing. Now I would use the pieces he abandoned to build the shell that would protect what he no longer respected. I opened my notebook and outlined a simple plan. The house would not be fortified in the traditional sense. No locks, no bars. That would only escalate the situation, draw attention, make things adversarial. Instead, I would create subtle disruptions, an architecture of unease, a pattern of uncertainty. My goal was not confrontation. It was erosion, small, inexplicable disturbances that would make presence feel unwelcome, unsafe, unexplainable. The house itself would speak in whispers. I began with lighting. I wired a circuit to the breaker box and installed a remote relay. The lights on the main floor would operate normally until triggered. I set up a second control path, accessible only from the basement, to override brightness, create flickers, even shift color temperature to make the environment feel colder, more sterile. I ordered new LED bulbs in bulk, ones capable of subtle strobing and timed dimming. They arrived the next day in plain boxes. I didn't label them. I stored them under the workbench, each socket marked with a note for future placement. Next came sound. I had an old Bluetooth speaker system in the garage, once used for holiday music. I repurposed it. I stripped the casings, rewired the inputs, and attached them to a system of narrow emitters I built using copper wire and salvaged radio parts. These wouldn't produce loud noises, just tones. Frequencies designed to be heard only at certain angles, in certain corners. A faint hum under the floorboards. A high-pitched ring by the bedroom door. A pulse behind the refrigerator. Not enough to alarm, just enough to gnaw. I tested each one in the basement before installation. Sitting in the dark, I listened as the tones moved through the space, almost imperceptible, like the murmur of memory itself. It wasn't frightening. It was uncertain. That was the point. Then I installed motion sensors. Nothing store-bought. I built my own using parts from an old security system I found at a yard sale a year ago. Most of it was still functional. With a soldering iron and a magnifying glass, I fused the elements into shape. The sensors would trigger timed events, light changes, sound activation, even the faint release of scent via heated pads soaked in pine oil and damp cedar. Familiar, but off. The kind of sensory memory that lingers and unsettles without reason. I placed each component into a labeled tray. Motion A, Light B, Audio C. I diagrammed the house in my notebook and began assigning zones. Hallway, kitchen, guest room, living room. The attic I left untouched, for now. I focused on the areas they were most likely to occupy, areas that had belonged to Marianne and me. I wasn't defending a fortress. I was reclaiming sacred ground. Wiring the kitchen took the longest. The cabinets were tight, the crawl space behind the oven narrow and thick with dust. I wore gloves and moved slowly. I didn't want to disturb anything permanently. The idea wasn't damage. It was distortion. The small sense that something wasn't quite right. A drawer that opened too easily. A light that hummed faintly when no one touched the switch. A chill near the pantry door that wasn't there the day before. The living room ceiling was another challenge. I had to climb into the narrow crawl space above it, where insulation hung in thick clouds. I placed 2 directional speakers there, set to emit randomized whispers, indistinct and layered. The sound of someone not quite speaking. The mind, when it cannot decode language, fills in the gaps with fear. I tested them myself and felt the hair rise on my arms. As night fell, the basement glowed with the soft amber of a single bulb. I stood at the workbench, surrounded by trays of wire and labeled maps, diagrams covered in arrows and codes. I wasn't tired. I was aware. My mind hadn't moved this sharply in years. The years of discipline from my teaching days had returned, not as memory, but as instinct. I was building not with anger, but with intent. Every solder, every fuse, every resistor was a line of defense written in silence. I created a master control box, not a computer, too traceable. Just a custom switch panel, wired to relays, hidden inside an old toolbox I lined with foam. I could carry it in and out of the house undetected. I could activate specific zones remotely through analog triggers. No Wi-Fi, no Bluetooth, no signals to intercept. Just switches, physical, private. I sat on the stool and stared at the wall across from me. An old map of the lake was still tacked there, yellowed, its edges curling. I reached up and pinned a new diagram beside it, the layout of the house with each circuit labeled. In that moment, the basement didn't feel like a workshop. It felt like a sanctum, a place where things began again. Above me, the house rested in darkness. Nothing had changed yet, but soon, very soon, the walls would whisper. The floor would creak with memory. The lights would shiver like breath in winter air. And those who thought they could rewrite the story of that house would learn otherwise. Not through force, not through law, through presence, through the unseen, through the wires in the basement. The house had eyes now. By the end of the week, every room had been threaded with wires, fitted with sensors, and layered in invisible systems that watched, listened, and waited. From the outside, nothing had changed. The paint still peeled near the window panes. The wind still whistled softly around the chimney. The steps creaked in all the same places. But inside, beneath the floorboards, behind the walls, hidden in vents and shadows, the house had transformed into something living. It breathed through currents. It whispered in static. It saw without blinking. I moved through the house differently once the system was complete. Slower, more deliberately. Every hallway became a path of circuitry. Every doorknob, a marker in a silent map. I had built something not for destruction, but for resistance. An architecture of discomfort, designed to erode confidence, to unravel certainty. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted unease, the kind that grows in the stomach without a name. The entryway was the first zone I finished. It was the point of arrival, the threshold. I installed a small infrared motion detector above the arch, hidden inside the crown molding. It linked to a subtle relay in the coat closet, which would, on cue, cause the light bulb in the hall to flicker. Not fully off, but just enough to catch the eye. Beneath the floorboards, I embedded a pressure sensor, just under the welcome mat, calibrated to detect even the softest step. When triggered, it would send a pulse to the speakers in the living room, activating a loop of low-frequency sound that mimicked a heartbeat, distant and irregular. The kitchen had its own language. I focused on water. People trust the consistency of taps, the predictability of flow. I installed a variable pressure valve beneath the sink, connected to a small actuator that could stutter the stream, make it hesitate, gasp, growl. Not every time, just once in a while. Enough to suggest something wrong with the pipes, or perhaps something deeper. Above the cabinets, I installed a pair of small projectors, not for video, but for shadows. They cast faint, slow-moving shapes that drifted along the walls in the periphery of vision, designed to vanish when looked at directly. I tested them at night, and even knowing they were mine, I felt my heart stutter when I saw the flicker move along the backsplash just beside the refrigerator. The upstairs hallway became the spine of the system, long and narrow, with 4 doors branching from it. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, 1 linen closet. I placed a single speaker in the attic hatch above the hallway, programmed to emit a soft thud at irregular intervals, like a footfall or the shifting of weight. It wouldn't play often, perhaps once every few hours, but when it did, it would sound real, as if someone or something was above them. In the guest room, I installed nothing overt, just a subtle adjustment of airflow. I added a small duct fan behind the vent, controlled by a dial in the basement. When activated, it would cause the curtains to flutter, ever so slightly. Movement without breeze. I tested it for hours, adjusting the angle, the timing. When I stood in the room and watched the fabric lift as if breathed upon, I knew it was enough. The main bathroom was fitted with a heat sensor embedded in the mirror frame. It didn't trigger sound or light. It simply logged movement, a silent record of who came and went. I added a second trigger near the baseboard heater, which once activated, caused a faint metallic ticking, like cooling pipes, but set to play on a delay, creating the illusion of recent presence even when the room was empty. Each night, I walked the perimeter of the house and listened, not for intruders, for the system itself, the clicks, the hums, the tiny shifts that meant the sensors were alive. I didn't need cameras. I didn't want to see them. I just needed to know that the house was responding, that it had become what I built it to be, an observer. Downstairs, the living room remained unchanged in appearance. The bookshelves still held Marianne's novels, the ones she read again and again. The fireplace sat cold. But behind the bricks, embedded in the mortar, I had placed a small transducer that could emit a low, subsonic hum, inaudible but physical. The kind of frequency that makes glass shiver, that unsettles the chest. I tested it by placing a water glass on the mantel. When the surface began to ripple, I knew the settings were right. I never triggered everything at once. That would be too obvious, too aggressive. The power of what I built lay in randomness, in the suggestion of pattern, in the sense that maybe, just maybe, something was wrong, but not enough to be sure. Doubt is a seed. It grows best in quiet. The basement, now the nerve center of it all, pulsed with faint light. The control box sat open on the workbench, its switches labeled by room and trigger type. I had memorized them. I didn't need the labels anymore. My fingers knew where to go. I could activate Zone 2 in less than a second. I could start a cycle in the guest room with a single flick. The house listened to me, and I, in turn, listened to the house. I slept less, not out of anxiety, but out of attention. I would sit in the chair by the window for hours, watching the porch, the tree line, the long gravel path. I waited. Not for visitors, for movement, for disturbance, for proof that the system had teeth. I wasn't angry anymore. What I felt was older than anger. It was something quiet, something fortified. The kind of resolve that comes after grief has turned to stone. They had taken space. Now they would feel it resist. The house wasn't a trap. It was a boundary, and it watched. I knew the moment they arrived. Even before the crunch of tires on gravel, before the swing of the front gate, before the faint echo of laughter and car doors shutting, I felt it. The air around the house shifted, not violently, but decisively, like a current changing direction. It was late afternoon, the sun already dipping low enough to stretch long shadows across the yard. I had left hours earlier and watched from a distance, parked half a mile away, where the bend in the road hid my presence. I didn't need to see their faces. I knew their movements, their routines, their expectations. They brought too much with them. I counted 3 large suitcases, 2 coolers, a folded-up portable crib. Someone had thought ahead. Someone had made plans. This wasn't a weekend visit. This was something more deliberate. They moved with the confidence of people who believed they belonged, as if entitlement had already cleared a path through my memories. I waited until dusk. I returned by foot, staying off the main road, moving through the trees. I had memorized the creaks and soft spots in the ground, every branch that liked to snap under the wrong footstep. I took the path near the east side of the house, the one we used to call the Fox Trail, because of how tight it wound between the trees and how Marianne swore she once saw a red tail disappear into the brush. That trail brought me within 20 feet of the kitchen window. I crouched under the pine and watched. The kitchen light was on, bright and warm, golden against the dark outside. Daniel leaned against the counter, holding a wine glass. Allison sat at the table, scrolling her phone with one hand, while her other reached for a piece of cheese. Their child, 2, maybe 3 years old, was playing with something on the floor, a plastic truck rolling back and forth, bumping softly into the table legs. The TV in the living room glowed silently behind them, casting a soft flicker across the walls. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. What I felt was alignment, precision, the calm of preparation giving way to action. I stepped back into the woods, reached into my coat pocket, and flipped the first switch on the remote relay. Then I walked away. Back in town, I waited. I gave them hours, let them settle in, let the house stretch around them, let it become familiar. That was the key. Nothing aggressive, not at first, only familiarity, just enough for the disruption to matter. At exactly 11:07 p.m., I began. It started with the hallway light. A flicker, brief, no more than half a second. Not enough to draw attention, just enough to register. Then, stillness. At 11:14, the kitchen tap sputtered when no one was near it. One brief cough of air in the pipe. At 11:26, a slow-moving shadow crossed the living room wall, drifting from left to right. It did not repeat. I watched it all through the system's passive sensors. No cameras, just response triggers, pressure, temperature, vibration. At 11:42, the floorboard under the linen closet let out a soft creak, though no one stood on it. At 11:53, the guest bedroom curtain moved, despite the window being closed. The child was the first to respond. I tracked his motion sensor. A sudden shift, the small body leaving the carpeted area by the bed and stepping into the hallway. A brief hesitation, then stillness, then retreat. I imagined him standing there, watching the corridor, unsure of what woke him, unsure why he suddenly felt he wasn't alone. At 12:09 a.m., I activated the whisper node in the attic above the master bedroom. A sound like weight shifting, something moving slowly on wood. Then silence. At 12:17, the water heater cycled without being used, creating a low thump in the pipes below the floor. The sound echoed through the vents, untraceable but unmistakable. By 12:30, Allison was awake. I tracked her movement from the bed to the kitchen. Her steps were cautious, not sleepy, not casual. She moved with the careful tread of someone trying not to admit they were afraid. The hallway light flicked on and off, twice, a gesture of reassurance. I made a note in my logbook, human response, illumination as defense. At 12:46, I triggered the front porch sensor, just once, enough to cause the porch light to blink. They must have checked the window, seen nothing, but the log told me Daniel got out of bed shortly after. I followed the sequence of sensors as he walked from the master bedroom into the hallway, paused, then into the living room. There he stood for nearly 5 minutes. I wondered what he saw. Perhaps nothing. Perhaps only the stillness of the room, the shadows where they'd always been, the curtains unmoved. Or maybe something imperceptible, an atmosphere that felt 1 degree too heavy, 1 breath too shallow. At 1:13 a.m., I triggered the baseboard heater distortion in the bathroom. A ticking sound, irregular, hollow, like footsteps in a pipe. Daniel checked the hallway again, then the front door, then the windows. He opened none of them. At 1:32, the child cried. Short, sharp, not from pain, but from fear. Allison rushed to the bedroom. The sensors showed her pace, fast, then slower. She stayed in the child's room for 12 minutes. She left the light on. I did nothing for 20 minutes. Let the house go still. Let them believe it had passed. Then, at 2:07 a.m., I activated the subsonic transducer behind the fireplace. A low, barely there hum. The glass in the windows did not shake. The furniture did not tremble. But the walls held it. I imagined them lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, not knowing why sleep wouldn't come. By 2:39, Daniel moved again. Down the stairs, into the kitchen. He opened the fridge, closed it, sat at the table. Did nothing, just sat, until 3:05. Then the lights in the living room dimmed, just for a breath, then returned. He stood up fast, walked into the hallway, then stopped. I ended the sequence at 3:17. By 4:12 a.m., all sensors were still. No movement, no lights, just quiet. But it wasn't the peace of rest. It was the stillness of people waiting for morning, of people too tired to search, too proud to admit discomfort, too disoriented to speak of what could not be explained. The house had done its work, not loudly, not cruelly, but with precision. And it would remember. The call came just after 7 a.m. I had been awake for hours, seated by the window in my small kitchen back in town, the same cup of lukewarm coffee going untouched as the steam faded into the stale morning air. The notebook sat open before me, last night's sequences sketched in orderly lines, checked and annotated. I wasn't looking for flaws. I was studying rhythm. The human response to uncertainty always left a pattern, and this pattern had only just begun. The phone buzzed sharply on the counter. I let it ring once, twice. Then I picked it up. Daniel's voice came through the receiver tight and low, pressed through clenched teeth. He didn't greet me. He didn't ask how I was. He launched straight into it, his words clipped, deliberate, but shaking at the edges. He said something was wrong with the house. He didn't know what exactly. Flickering lights, noises in the attic, water pressure fluctuations. He listed the events like a man reading a list of grievances in court, careful to sound rational, but failing. He said it felt deliberate. I said nothing. Just let the silence fill the space where explanation usually lived. That silence is where people unravel. I knew this. I had taught through it, lived through it, buried loved ones in it. He started again, louder this time. The tone shifted from suspicion to accusation. He wanted to know if I'd done something, if I'd tampered with the wiring, with the plumbing, if I'd left behind some sort of surveillance system. The irony was bitter in my throat. Surveillance was a word people used when they felt watched by something they didn't understand, something they couldn't prove. He wanted me to confess to ghosts. I didn't. I simply told him the truth. The house was old. That strange things happened in old houses, especially when people went looking for them. He hung up on me. By 8:15 a.m., I received a message from Allison, a carefully composed email, more formal than personal. She wrote that they were experiencing anomalies in the house that were creating a non-ideal environment for their child. She mentioned safety. She mentioned health. She suggested that perhaps the house had suffered structural degradation in recent years and that a professional inspection might be warranted. I didn't reply. At 9:03, another email arrived, this one from her father, Michael. Shorter, less cautious. He accused me of endangerment. He said he had every right to involve authorities. He used words like toxic environment, legal exposure, and malicious neglect. It was an attempt to rattle, to provoke. But provocation requires emotional investment. I had long since passed that threshold. At 10:12, a car arrived at the lake house. The sensors flagged movement. 3 men stepped out, one in a branded van with a ladder rack, the other 2 in casual jackets, holding tool bags. Contractors, possibly electricians, possibly private investigators dressed like them. I didn't care which. The system remained dormant. I had designed it that way. Unless specific inputs were triggered, it would not react. Let them look. Let them scan walls and sockets and panels. They would find nothing illegal, nothing harmful, nothing they could name. I watched from a distance, parked again near the old ranger station, where the tree cover was thick enough to obscure the road, but open enough to give me a clear view through binoculars. I noted how long they stayed. 73 minutes. When they left, they carried nothing out. No wires, no broken parts, no evidence, just puzzled looks and unanswered questions. By noon, I knew the next stage had begun. At 12:47, Daniel called again. This time he left a message. He said we needed to talk, that things had gone too far, that he didn't want to involve the police, but if he had to, he would. That he was trying to be respectful, but I was making that difficult. He kept circling back to the same word, family, as if that word still meant something fixed, as if it had not been eroded over years of absence, of decisions made without consultation, of quiet dismissals. I played the message twice, not to hear his words, but to hear what was underneath them. Fear, not of me, but of something he couldn't control. He thought he could take the house, plant himself there, install his people, repurpose what had been built with hands that were not his. And now, the house was resisting. Not violently, not obviously, but enough. At 2 p.m., the doorbell rang at my place in town. I opened the door to find Daniel standing on the porch, alone, wearing his frustration like a suit too small. He didn't ask to come in. He began speaking as soon as I appeared, pacing slightly, gesturing toward a folder in his hand. Inside were printouts, schedules of maintenance logs, old emails between us, screenshots of electrical permits. He tried to construct a case, a timeline that painted me as unstable, vindictive, irrational. He mentioned the will. He mentioned my age. He said the word incapacitation as though rehearsing it. I said nothing. He said they had talked to a lawyer, that there might be grounds for an emergency claim of shared ownership, that at the very least he could file for injunction. He asked me, one final time, to work this out reasonably. I asked if he believed the house was unsafe. He nodded. I asked if he wanted to leave. He hesitated, then nodded again. I told him simply that he could. And then I shut the door. Behind it, I leaned against the wood and exhaled slowly. The first part was complete. They had named their fear. They had defined their discomfort. That was power, making someone articulate the thing they wished to deny. The rest would follow. All I had to do was keep the system steady, keep the rhythm intact. The house would take care of the rest. It didn't need violence. It didn't need confrontation. It only needed patience, and I had that in abundance. By the time the leaves turned brittle and orange along the edge of the sidewalk outside my house in town, I had already built the second perimeter. The first had been physical: wires, switches, signals, shadows. But this one would be quieter, drier, and far more difficult to breach. It would be made not of walls or glass, but of paper, signed, notarized, certified, filed, and recorded. This perimeter would not flicker or whisper. It would stand silently in drawers and folders, in filing cabinets and desk safes. Its strength measured not in volts or circuits, but in law and language. If they wanted to contest ownership, redefine intention, restructure memory, then I would answer them in print. It started with a trip to Russell. He was older now than when we last shared a beer on my porch nearly a decade ago, but his mind was sharp, and his cynicism had matured like scotch, darker, smoother, and without pretense. He didn't ask unnecessary questions. I brought a manila envelope to his office in the old courthouse building. the kind with brass fasteners and a red string tie, and laid it flat on the table between us. Inside were copies of every relevant document I owned: the deed to the lake house, the original mortgage statements from 1974, the final payment stub from 1996, the joint ownership clause between me and Marianne, and the full probate file processed after her death. Russell flipped through the documents slowly. He asked if there were any liens, lawsuits, secondary claims. I told him no. He nodded and said, "Then we start here." That was all I needed. Over the next 2 weeks, I worked in silence. By day, I sat at my kitchen table or in the library downtown, surrounded by folders and codes and precedents. I read property law until the lines blurred together. I highlighted sections. I tabbed pages. I wrote lists in the margins. I wasn't trying to win an argument. I was constructing a fortress. The strategy formed in layers. First, Russell filed an affidavit of reaffirmation of ownership, a redundant but deliberate gesture, one that signaled legal clarity and confirmed uncontested property rights. Then came a secondary move, drafting a revocable transfer of ownership to a charitable trust, one I had researched carefully, the Minnesota Veterans Healing Fund. They accepted donations of land and buildings and used them for transitional housing, recovery programs, and long-term shelter for combat veterans struggling with reintegration. The idea had come to me quietly one night, while reading a newspaper article about state underfunding and veteran homelessness. I imagined the house being used again, but not for wine glasses and entitlement. I imagined it filled with silence that healed, not haunted. I imagined someone finding rest there who had nowhere else to go, and crucially, I imagined it protected. The structure was simple. I would transfer the property to the trust but retain a life estate. That meant I could live there until my death. No one could evict me, override me, or make claims while I was alive. Afterward, the house would pass fully into the hands of the organization. Daniel and Allison would inherit nothing, not the structure, not the land, not the shoreline, not the trees. They would find themselves disinherited not by vengeance, but by paperwork, not erased, but simply absent. Russell made sure every document was bulletproof. He arranged for a licensed appraiser to file an evaluation of the property. He coordinated with a notary, a clerk, and a courthouse contact. When I asked him if it was overkill, he looked at me with the quiet sternness of someone who had buried too many clients under their own assumptions. "No," he said, "it's a wall, and you're going to need it." So I built it. Every letterhead, every signature, every notarized stamp became another stone in the structure. I attached my medical records, affirming mental clarity and independent function. I wrote a personal statement, 2 pages in longhand, explaining the intent of the gift. I referenced Marianne. I referenced my years of care. I referenced nothing about Daniel or his wife or their presence in the house. I wanted no emotional fingerprints, only clarity. The trust responded within days. They were grateful. They sent a representative, Angela Morris, 40-ish, composed, carrying a leather case and a voice like calm water. She walked through my documents with me in the library reading room, pointing to each page, confirming the logistics, affirming the transition. She said they could begin preparing the deed transfer immediately. When I asked if they needed time to deliberate, she shook her head gently. "We've seen worse," she said. "We've seen louder. You're doing this for the right reason." That night, I returned home with the finalized draft of the agreement. I laid it flat on the table and stared at the signature line. It was blank, waiting. I placed the pen down beside it and left the room. I walked through the house, slowly. I moved through the living room, where the light from the street lamps filtered through the curtains like dusk-colored water. I stepped into the hallway, touched the corner where Marianne once hung her scarves, and paused in the doorway of the room where I kept her books, her coats, her handwritten recipes. I looked around, not to remember, but to affirm. Everything in the house had already served its purpose. It had carried the weight of a life, and now it would carry the weight of something else. In the morning, I signed. The pen moved steadily. No hesitation, no flourish, just ink on paper, clean and final. Russell filed the documents the same day. The courthouse clerk sent confirmation. The public record updated within 48 hours. The trust's name appeared next to mine. My life estate clause was embedded in every version. It was finished. The house no longer belonged to a line of inheritance. It belonged to intention. Paper walls, quiet, steady, absolute. And behind those walls, I finally exhaled. The morning of the transfer was cold and windless, the kind of stillness that settles over a place just before snow. I woke early, not out of nerves, but out of something closer to ceremony. There are days in life that feel rehearsed, even when they are happening for the first time. Days that move forward with such quiet finality that you don't question whether it's the right decision. You simply follow the steps you've already lived in your mind. I dressed with care, not in anything new or theatrical, just in the clothes I used to wear when I accompanied Marianne to town meetings or Veterans Day events. Wool trousers, a pressed flannel shirt, a jacket with corduroy elbows that had outlived at least 2 presidents. I tied my shoes slowly. Every motion seemed weighted, not by doubt, but by intent. I drove to the courthouse in Duluth with the folder in the passenger seat. It was sealed now, its contents complete. Deed transfer, life estate provision, tax exemption forms, charitable beneficiary certification, and a letter from me addressed not to the court or the trust, but to the future, typed neatly, dated carefully, signed in black ink. At the recorder's office, everything moved quickly. Paper slid across counters. Stamps thudded. The clerk, a young woman with hair pulled back tight and a voice that barely rose above a whisper, handled the paperwork with the detached grace of someone accustomed to processing beginnings and endings without needing to witness either. She didn't ask questions. She didn't blink when she saw the name of the trust. She just read, confirmed, recorded. Russell was there, standing beside me like an anchor. He said little, just nodded at each stage. His presence was a comfort, not because I needed guidance, but because I respected quiet witnesses. Too much of my life had been filled with noise that went nowhere. Today, I wanted the silence of formality. The silence that says, "This matters." Once everything was signed, notarized, and archived, the clerk handed me a stamped copy for my records. A second copy went into the trust's file. The third would be uploaded into the county's public database. Just like that, the lake house was no longer a private asset. It had become a public promise. I stepped out of the building with the weight of permanence on my shoulders, but it didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. The air was colder now, biting at my face. I got back in the truck and drove north without stopping, back toward the lake. The trees along the road stood stiff and bare, their last leaves clinging to the branches like old thoughts too stubborn to fall. The sky was pale and streaked with high clouds. I arrived at the house just before noon. Angela, the trust representative, was already there. She stood at the edge of the driveway, arms folded against the wind, her expression unreadable, but calm. She greeted me with a nod, and no more. I appreciated that. Words had already been spoken. The documents had already spoken louder. We walked the property together. I showed her the boundaries, the small shed that leaned toward collapse, the stone path that cracked under the frost, the dock that groaned underfoot when stepped on too quickly. She took everything in with the eyes of someone not evaluating value, but possibility. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and old winter. I had opened the windows briefly that morning to let in fresh air, but the walls still held memory, like a scent. We moved through each room slowly. She took notes, not with surprise or judgment, but with purpose. Her steps were light, careful not to disturb the dust that had begun to gather again in corners. She asked a few questions about maintenance, when the roof had last been checked, whether the water heater had been replaced, if there were any access issues in winter. I answered factually. She made no remarks about aesthetics, no comments about decor. The house, to her, was not a canvas for personal taste. It was a structure of healing. We ended in the living room, where the light filtered through the same curtains Marianne had sewn decades ago. Angela looked around, then down at the floor, and said she could feel the quiet in the wood. I said nothing. That was enough. Before she left, she handed me a folder with a welcome letter from the Trust's board, an outline of their upcoming site visits, and a schedule for repairs. She assured me I would not be disturbed. My right to stay, to live, to move freely within the house was protected. She also confirmed that the Trust would issue a public statement later that week, not a press release, just a quiet mention in their seasonal newsletter and local veterans bulletin. As she drove away, I stood on the porch for a long time. The road stretched out in both directions, empty. No sounds but the wind through the dry grass and the soft tick of the porch light against the wood. I watched the trees shift slightly, their bare branches clicking faintly in the breeze. Everything around me felt suspended, not in time, but in definition. The house was mine, but no longer mine. I would live here, but I would not die as an owner. I had not lost it. I had given it forward, and I had done it on my terms. Later that afternoon, I sat at the kitchen table and unfolded the letter again, the one I had written for the file. I reread it slowly. It was not emotional, not a plea, just a statement of why. I had written that this house was not built for inheritance, but for use. That too often, families confuse possession with love and walls with legacy. That I had watched the erosion of meaning begin the moment entitlement entered the doorway. That by giving it away, I had preserved its purpose. I ended the letter with one sentence. Let this house shelter people who understand silence. I folded it back into the envelope and returned it to the desk drawer. Outside, the sky turned steel gray. Snow would come soon. I made tea, moved slowly through the living room, and sat near the fireplace. I didn't light it. I just listened. The floor creaked beneath me in the same place it always had. The window ticked faintly as the cold pressed against the glass. The house was still watching, still waiting. But not for them. It was waiting for something new. The letter arrived 3 days after the transfer. It was hand-delivered, not by a courier, but by Daniel himself. He didn't knock. He simply left it wedged between the door and the frame, the envelope stiff and white against the fading green paint. By the time I opened the door, he was already walking down the driveway, hands in his coat pockets, head bent against the wind. He didn't turn back. Inside, the letter was typed. Too formal for family, too emotional for business, a strange hybrid of polite hostility. He called it a proposal to resolve a misunderstanding. He referenced family heritage. He appealed to memory. He talked about a space that belongs to all of us in spirit, even if not in name. Toward the end, he said he would appreciate the opportunity to sit down face to face and discuss options before pursuing legal remedies. I read it twice, then folded it once and placed it beside the teapot. I let it sit there overnight. In the morning, I called Russell. He said it was expected. He said that when people lose control, they try to build doors where there are none. He advised that we meet, on neutral ground, with documentation in hand. Nothing verbal, nothing off the record, everything official. We scheduled the meeting for the following Thursday at Russell's office. Not a courthouse, not my home, not theirs. a sterile in-between room where voices echo softly off drywall and the smell of printer toner lingers in the air. I arrived first. Russell was already there, preparing copies of the documents, laying out the agenda like a military plan. He placed a yellow legal pad in front of me and told me to write nothing. At 10:04 a.m., Daniel entered with Allison beside him. She wore dark glasses despite the lack of sun. Her mouth was set in a line too sharp to be polite. Daniel looked thinner than I remembered, less sure of himself, though he tried to mask it behind tight gestures and careful words. They brought a man with them, a lawyer, younger than both of them, with a plastic smile and a leather binder full of nothing. No one shook hands. Russell began with introductions, then outlined the purpose of the meeting. There would be no arguments, no emotional appeals, only verification, clarification, a laying down of facts. Daniel spoke first. He said the house had meant something to his mother, that she had always intended for it to remain in the family, that he had grown up there, that his own child deserved to build memories in that space, that it was a legacy. He used the word betrayal more than once. Allison added that they had invested time and money into maintaining the property, though she didn't specify how. She mentioned stress. She mentioned disruption. She said the recent events had left her family deeply unsettled. She looked at me when she said it, but I looked only at Russell's pen. Then the lawyer took over. He referenced statutes, theories of joint ownership, the possibility of challenging mental competency at the time of transfer. He smiled too often. He used phrases like amicable resolution and expedited settlement. He slid a paper across the table with the word mediation typed in bold at the top. Russell didn't touch it. Instead, he opened the folder containing the stamped deed transfer. He laid it flat on the table. He followed it with the trust's confirmation letter. Then the life estate agreement, the tax exemptions, the evaluation documents, the notarized affidavits, the personal statement, the appointment schedules. Each one placed deliberately, like stones across a river. He spoke with precision, calm, authority. He reminded them that the house was no longer private property, that the transfer was legal, binding, irrevocable, that any attempt to challenge it would be met, not with argument, but with institutional backing, legal defense, and the full weight of a registered charitable organization. He explained that life estate meant what it said. I could live there until death. They could not access the house. They could not use it. They could not alter its status. They could not enter the land, even to retrieve items they once claimed as theirs. He paused, then handed their lawyer a single-page document, a formal notice of no trespass, signed, copied, filed. Allison shifted in her seat. Daniel leaned forward, his voice quieter now, closer to something that might once have been familiar. He said he didn't understand how I could do this to him. He asked if I thought he was unworthy, if I believed he'd let the house fall into disrepair, if I thought he didn't love it like I did. I said nothing, because there are things that cannot be explained to people who see memory as entitlement, who mistake comfort for ownership, who believe being born is enough to inherit the labor of others. Russell closed the folder and stood. The meeting was over. Daniel didn't stand right away. He looked at the table, at the papers, as if they were a language he could no longer read. Allison rose quickly, her heels clicking across the floor, her silence louder than any accusation. Their lawyer offered a polite nod. He took nothing with him. Outside, the sky had turned white and heavy. Snow was coming. I walked to my truck and sat behind the wheel, hands on the steering wheel for a long time before turning the key. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel victorious, but I felt the walls around me hold steady, built not of wood or wire, but of words. And that was enough. Winter settled in with slow certainty, the kind that didn't announce itself with blizzards or storms, but crept along the eaves, glazed the windows, and silenced the earth beneath a steady accumulation of white. The lake froze over quietly. No cracks, no loud breaks, just a thick, pale surface that shimmered under the weak light of a December sun. I watched it every morning from the kitchen window as I brewed tea and stood barefoot on cold tiles, listening to the creaks of a house beginning to shift toward something new. By then, the systems had been dismantled. The sensors came out first. One by one, I removed them from their hiding places: the crown molding, the light fixtures, behind the baseboards. I kept a notebook open on the table and crossed each zone off as I stripped it bare. The whisper emitters, the subsonic generator, the shadow projectors, all of it was pulled, boxed, and stored in the basement with careful labeling and sealed lids. Not destroyed, just paused. I hadn't decided if they would ever be used again. Maybe they wouldn't need to be. Maybe the house had done its part. After the systems, I turned to the wires. That took longer. My fingers, not as steady as they used to be, fumbled at times with the finer threads. But I worked patiently. I sat cross-legged on the attic floor and unwound spools of copper, dust in my nose, insulation clinging to my sweater. The house groaned around me, but the groan felt different now, less burdened, less watchful, as if it too was breathing easier. I patched the drywall, painted over the seams, replaced bulbs with soft, warm ones. I opened every window for 10 minutes on a rare day, when the temperature rose just above freezing, letting the air inside turn over. The curtains danced in the sudden breeze, and for a brief second, I saw them move the way they used to, when Marianne walked through the hall with her arms full of folded towels. The rooms were quieter after that. I vacuumed the rugs, aired out the closets, burned cedarwood incense in the evenings. I played old jazz records on the turntable in the corner. I lit the fireplace, not out of necessity, but because the crackle was its own kind of company. The scent of burning pine filled the house and crawled up the walls like memory. One morning, Angela returned. She came with another woman I hadn't met before, someone from the trust who had a background in logistics and infrastructure. Her name was Lucille, and she wore a red scarf and thick gloves and walked the property with a kind of reverence. They didn't come with clipboards or forms. They came to see, to feel, to begin. We walked through the house together. I told them which rooms held the best light in the mornings. I showed them the latch on the screen door that liked to stick in the rain. I told them the attic window rattled when the wind blew from the west. They listened. They took nothing. They made no claims. They asked only one thing. Could I be there when the first guests arrived? I said yes. The preparations happened quietly. There was no construction, no renovation, just soft touches. A second-hand armchair in the upstairs reading nook, a bookshelf added to the guest bedroom, now labeled simply Room 2. A fresh coat of white paint on the kitchen cabinets, leaving the old wood handles intact. The pantry was restocked with simple things: rice, tea, lentils, canned goods, bread flour, oatmeal. I saw the receipt once, left on the counter by accident. It was signed by a volunteer from Marrowfield. The house didn't change. It just adjusted. Outside, the snow deepened. The driveway was plowed twice a week by a man named Curtis, who never spoke more than 10 words at a time. I liked him. He nodded at me each time, and I nodded back. The lake remained frozen, its surface marked by the occasional tracks of deer or a brave fox. Then, in early January, they came. The first guests arrived just after sunrise. A dark green van pulled into the drive, followed by a sedan. 3 men and 1 woman stepped out. Veterans, all of them, as Angela had told me. Each carried a duffel bag. Each looked at the house, not with awe, but with a sort of searching caution, as if uncertain whether they could trust what waited inside. I didn't greet them at the door. That wasn't my place. I watched from the window, sipping tea, as Lucille met them on the porch and led them through the front door one by one. She moved slowly, explaining, pointing, inviting. The men walked softly, as if afraid to leave tracks. The woman lingered in the doorway before stepping inside. The house didn't resist. It opened. That evening, I lit the fire again. From my seat in the corner of the living room, I could hear faint sounds through the walls. Footsteps, the rustle of unpacking, someone opening a window upstairs. I didn't eavesdrop. I just listened to the rhythm of habitation return. Later that week, I passed one of the men on the path near the dock. We didn't speak. He looked out over the lake, hands deep in his coat pockets. I could see his breath against the gray air. He stood there for a long time. Then he turned, nodded at me once, and walked back toward the house. Something shifted in me after that. A loosening. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to sleep through the night without waking. The house no longer needed me to guard it. It had new breath now, new silence. Marianne would have liked that. The last thing I did that week was open a small wooden box I had kept in the back of my closet for years. Inside were photographs. Us building the house in 1974, standing on the dock with wind-blown hair, sipping coffee in the morning sun. I chose 3. I framed them simply. I placed one in the hallway, one in the library, and one in the small alcove upstairs where the sun hit just right at 10 a.m. I didn't label them. I didn't explain. Let them be what they were. Echoes. Quiet reminders that something had come before. That something had survived long enough to become useful again. The house was no longer mine. But it was doing what it was always meant to do. It was healing. The first thaw came with no announcement. No dramatic melt or sudden warmth. Just the soft sound of dripping, somewhere beyond the porch, steady and rhythmic, like a clock ticking in reverse. The lake remained frozen, but the edges had started to loosen, seeping into the soil with each rising sun. I noticed it in the way the snow no longer crunched, but sagged beneath my boots. The house, always attuned to the subtle changes, began to breathe differently. Inside, the air smelled faintly of earth. The floors creaked less. The walls felt warmer. Curtains moved more freely. The firewood burned faster. Even the old armchair by the window, once stiff and reluctant, welcomed me now with a softness that hadn't been there in years. The house had shifted, and I had shifted with it. There was no singular moment that marked the point of no return, no final word, no thunderous closure. The irreversibility had not come with the transfer of ownership or the signing of a document. It had seeped in over time, the way silence replaces argument, the way dust settles over a once contested space. You don't see it happening. But then one day, you wake up, and the path behind you is gone. One morning, I opened the drawer in the hallway desk and found the original keys to the lake house. The ones Daniel had once used when he visited with sincerity, before ownership became negotiation, before memory became territory. I turned them over in my hand. They no longer had weight, just shape. They no longer opened anything that needed to be opened. Still, I placed them in an envelope and left them in a box labeled Archive. I wrote the date on the flap. I did not seal it. Later that week, a letter came. It was from Daniel, not printed or typed, but written in his handwriting. The same blocky, careful script he used as a boy when copying spelling words. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't accuse. He wrote that he had driven past the lake the previous weekend, that he had seen the van parked out front, the lights on upstairs, the smoke rising from the chimney. He said the house looked different. He said he understood now. He wrote that he hadn't known how much of himself was built around the idea of someday owning it, not living in it, not using it, just possessing it. And that when it became clear that would never happen, something in him cracked, but not from loss, from the end of illusion. He said he didn't blame me anymore, that maybe, in time, he would even be thankful. I didn't write back. Some things don't need an answer. Some things only require acknowledgement. I folded the letter and placed it alongside the others I had saved. Not many, but enough to know that even silence has a paper trail. The guests continued to arrive, one van at a time, one weekend after another. Veterans with eyes that had seen too much. Some stayed a few days, others stayed longer. They walked the property in the early morning, their boots pressing deep tracks into the snow. They sat on the dock even when the lake was still frozen, breathing in the cold and letting the wind clear something unnamed from their lungs. I kept my distance. I did not interfere, but I was present. Every evening, I lit a single lamp in the reading room and left the door open. Some came in, some didn't. Those who did rarely spoke. They sat in the armchair or by the window. They picked up a book, sometimes read a page or two, and then just held it in their hands like something steady. Occasionally, one would nod to me on their way out. A small gesture. Enough. The house absorbed it all. The pain, the quiet, the release. It took in every breath and gave nothing back but stillness. The kind of stillness that doesn't feel empty but full. The kind that makes space for healing not by curing, but by holding. This house, our house now no longer mine, had become what I never knew it could be. Not a place to hide. Not a monument to a life lost. But a passage. It had moved past ownership. Past legacy. It existed now in its truest form. Function without ego. Shelter without narrative. One afternoon, I walked down to the dock alone. The ice on the lake had thinned to a thin membrane of glass, shivering under the weight of the wind. I sat on the bench Marianne and I had once built together, the wood worn smooth by years of sun and snow. I looked out at the water and thought of nothing. That was the miracle. There was no grand reflection, no cinematic closure. Just quiet. Before heading back, I left something on the bench. A photo of the house taken from the shore, framed in a piece of driftwood we'd found the year after the roof was redone. I placed it there without note, without name. It would remain, or it wouldn't. Either way, it belonged to the moment now. That night, I placed the final copy of the deed, the welcome letter from the trust, and the transfer agreement into a fireproof box in the hall closet. I labeled it not with my name, but with the coordinates of the house. Not out of secrecy, but out of truth. Names fade, coordinates remain. Irreversibility doesn't mean loss, it means arrival. Arrival at a point beyond which there is no need to look back. I went to sleep with the window cracked open and the sound of soft wind moving through the trees. The house didn't speak. It had said everything already.